The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Emma Williams. I'm speaking to you guys from Exago today. I'm very excited for today's lab. It's going to be a little bit different than most of the other labs in the series thus far. But first things first, if you guys could just let me know that I'm coming through loud and clear, type a Y or a yes. Awesome. Good morning. Great to have you all here. Okay, cool. So once again, my name is Emma Williams. I'm going to be delivering Exago's end user support lab today. And today we're going to kind of do a summary lab. And what I mean by that is take all of the bits and pieces, functionalities, best practices, all the tips and tricks we've given you over the past, oh my gosh, almost 2 years now in end user labs, and bring them together into one complete report design. Now, we're not going to touch on everything, right? We're not going to do maps today. We won't touch dashboarding. This is going to be a start to finish in the advanced report designer. Without further ado, let's jump in. So I'm going to go to my next slide and just make sure that my screen is not paused. Made that mistake before. So what are we focusing on today, aside from building a report, right? I'd like to bring, or rather draw attention, really bring to the forefront of your mind, what does the output, be that a mock-up, maybe we have a visual component. Today I'm going to show you the output that we're going for. Maybe all you have is a description from a manager of what this report should look like and what information it should show. We're going to talk about, based on that, what to do as far as the structure of your report, maybe the order that you build it, really just things to consider when you're really, when you have a goal in mind, when you have a very specific goal in mind. Now we're going to be using the Advanced Report Designer, so this is going to give us cell-by-cell control. We're going to do a lot of manual manipulation today. We're going to talk about strategies for report design. This takes structure into account, this takes formatting into account, and it's also, of course, going to consider functionality, lots of functionality. Finally, some formatting tips for maybe those of us that are not on the marketing team. Aesthetics are not my strong suit, so I'm going to give you some tips from the report design side, when really what you're focused on is the functionality, giving meaning to the data. It still has to look nice. So how can we make it aesthetically pleasing and easily consumable by any viewer without spending hours trying to figure out what colors look good and where to put what size font, right? All right. Specific features. And really this slide is here so that anyone watching the recording knows feature-wise, functionality-wise, what we're going to touch on today. The lab has a lot more to offer than just these specific topics, but I just like to put it here again so you guys know some of the things we're going to talk about. Very quickly, charts in groups are something that personally I'm a big fan of. I like to be able to show a metric visually per some field. So placing it in a group header or a group footer as opposed to a report header or footer allows us to do so. We're going to talk about that today. Conditional formatting. Now this is something that we've done before, right? But maybe there's some corner cases or some tips and tricks that we can continue to build upon. With regards to charts, we're also going to talk about benchmark lines. Lots of things about charts today, so definitely pay attention to that part of the lab if you're particularly interested in creating those visualizations. Cell referencing, doing some formatting using formulas. We do have a toolbar and plenty of options to format your data or your report or your canvas, but you can also use formulas. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Nested formulas as well as nested groupings and collapsible groupings. Now this really can add so much to the output of our report, and it's very simple in the design phase. So we're going to talk about the benefits there as well. Again, formatting tips, and then using the sort by aggregate functionality. If this is something you haven't played with yet, it's definitely something that you should. First, the output, right? Let's take a look at what we're going for. What is our goal today? I'm going to go over to Exago. Now, I'm running a local copy of Exago. Picture this in an embedded application, right? Maybe it's launched right from the host app and just takes up part of the screen, right? Let's kind of try to envision this as a true use case. Now, because we're working from an output today, we're going to kind of take the stand that maybe you've been given a mock-up of the report that you'd like to create. So as a business analyst, how do I look at this and know what Exago will need to get to this endpoint? First things first, I've got some column headers here. Now, I'm not going to talk, when I initially walk through the report, I'm not going to talk about what it indicates to me that will be necessary on the input side. I'm just going to talk about what we see first. So at the top level, we've got employee information. For each employee, it's showing me the average days to ship, so the difference in days between the order date and the date that the shipment went out, and the total late deliveries. Now, late means that it did not arrive by the required date. We have a required date metric. Understanding the data that you're working with is a very important part of report design. The way I'm speaking about this is indicating that I understand the data values and the metrics I'm going to have to work with. That's an important first step before you begin designing a report. Without knowing what you have available to you, you can't possibly design a report in the best way possible. If I expand on any employee, I'll choose Nancy DeVolio just for fun. We're first going to see a chart. Now, the chart displays two metrics, two series. The first, and I'm going to click this one to suppress it. I'd just like to view this one for now. The first is the order count. Appears to be in descending order. And if I hover, I can see the value, the label, etc. So I get an indication of potentially the fact that this right-hand axis is corresponding to this series itself. If I bring back the average days to ship, I can see that this benchmark line is corresponding to that. So I've really got some good information here. Additionally, I saw all of my information expand down here, right? It wasn't just the chart that opened up for me. This is showing me more information. These two metrics are the same, but it's per country this time. So for USA, Germany, France, etc., I see these average days to ship and total late deliveries metric. I noticed that a couple of the values are highlighted in red. It looks like 10 and 11 is where that change occurs. So anything over 10 appears to be highlighted in red, and we have the same over here. Now, if I expand a country, and I'm going to choose one that has a number, a value other than 0 for total late deliveries. Let's open up France. These are line items. We have individual order IDs, order dates. Now, this days to ship metric appears to be very similar to average days to ship, but again, it's a line item. Every record has a corresponding days to ship value. And my schedule field is pretty interesting. It looks like I'm not displaying the date that it arrived or the how many days it was late by. I'm actually displaying text that just tells a user on time or late. All right, so based on this, what do I need to consider for report design? Let's hop back to my nice PowerPoint. So there's three categories that I've broken this into. We have structural things to keep in mind, functional things to keep in mind, and then I separated the chart out because there's a few very important things that we need to remember about that and take into account. So I've made that its own consideration. Structurally, we're showing hierarchical information. We're also expanding our groupings. So I've used Exago successfully for years now. I know that when I'm doing collapsible groups, I like to indent just a little bit from the left-hand side. That way the arrow is not backed up against the left-hand border, column, whatever that might be. So that is a tip that I've kind of picked up just from using the tool, right? A lot of those things are likely going to be things that I'd like to share with you all today. So we're going to want to indent initially on that first one, but also to illustrate the hierarchy on the second grouping, that country grouping. We need at least two sorts. on employee and on country, we saw individual groups. We know that we need sorts to make groups in Exago, so that's going to be something we need to consider. Additionally, a detail section to show those line items. So when building our report, we want to make sure we leave a detail section there for us to work with. And finally, we were showing aggregate information in the headers. This means that we're going to need suppressed footers that actually calculate those aggregates. Additionally, we're going to need to use cell referencing to display them in the headers. Those are both things that are really important for me to know in design. It dictates that before I'm able to place the value in the header, I need to create the footer, I need to put the aggregate information in the footer, and eventually I need to suppress that footer. Those are all things to remember. Functionally, we've got some other things to keep in mind. We're going to need formulas to display both of the rightmost detail columns as well as everything displayed in the headers. Additionally, and this is something that you tend to pick up the more you use Exago, but based on the contextually aware nature of our formulas, you often can display summary information for different groupings by either copying the same formula or just modifying it slightly. I'm going to show you how to simplify your formula building process by starting with the most simple version of that formula and just expanding it bit by bit to be appropriate for other sections and potentially a little bit different of an aggregation. We're going to need some conditional formatting. We saw a bunch of areas of our chart that we had red indicating some value was higher than we wanted. We were sorting by aggregate. Now we were sorting by the aggregate value order count, which is actually only displayed in our chart. We weren't showing that anywhere else on the report. But we did sort the rest of the report by that aggregate value. Now this is a really cool thing because it indicated to us the companies that were responsible for the most volume first. Even when I opened each employee, we saw the countries displayed in order of that aggregate value order count. So USA was first for the group that I actually expanded because it was responsible for the largest number of orders. This puts potentially the highest priority grouping at the top. So we start with the ones that are buying the most from us. We also had alternate row shading on the details section. Now this one's a little bit less important to really keep in mind before you start designing, but it is something that we may have noticed on the output, and I'd just like to mention it here. Finally, the chart. We had two y-axes. This indicates that we need a combination chart. We also placed the chart in a header. Now I know that it was in a header because it was preceding a detail section on the employee. This is indicating to me that though charts generally speaking are placed in a footer, usually you are showing aggregate information for the entire tabular report displayed above. In this case, it made more sense to show it first and then show the countries broken down further. So we're going to put it in a header today to keep it right at the top the way we saw it on output. Finally, we had a benchmark line set at the value of 10 on y-axis 1. It was corresponding to days to ship. So we'll want to keep that in mind. All right, so a bit of a lengthier PowerPoint piece today just because there is a lot to consider before you start designing a report. I wanted to make sure that we walked through it all in its entirety. But without further ado, we're going to start from scratch today on this. So I'm going to open up a completely new advanced report. You guys are going to build it with me today. So let's get going. If you do have any questions on anything that I have covered so far, feel free to start typing in the box or finish up if you've already began. Questions are welcome at any point during the lab. I do have two of my colleagues here to help out. So they're happy to answer some questions. Of course, if there's anything applicable to the whole group, I'd be happy to answer it live. Okay, so I'm going to grab a couple categories. One thing I want to mention, I'm not going to be spending a lot of time on steps like how to add sections today. We are assuming a base understanding of Exago at this lab. since you're here to build a report start to finish, right? The focus is putting it all together, what to keep in mind, not specific functionalities like adding sections, right? All right. So sorts, this is one of the things we mentioned. We know we want to sort on employee ID, and I know that will be my primary sort. I also want one on the country. We're going to be good there. Now, this is an interesting one and very likely not something you guys consider in report design, but it's really important. Filtering out null values that might exist in your database. Now, this is part of understanding your data, but I know that my shipped date field has some null values. Potentially, some of my employees just aren't very good about updating the CRM or whatever they're using to log the data. So I know that there's some missing shipped date metrics. Now, shipped date is going to be used in this calculation as well as this calculation. Since that's the case, I know I don't want any null values. Going to go ahead and add shipped date not equal to null. Oops, sorry about that. And that's going to automatically filter out those null values for me, so I don't need to deal with it later. Finishing my wizard, I'm brought to the design canvas. Now we're going to begin first structurally. We're going to set up our report for our data. I'll actually run it with no data on here. We'll just have some static text and see what that looks like. First things first, I mentioned creating the hierarchy. So I'm going to shrink columns A and B down. This will create a nice step for me. Absolutely, I can zoom in. Let's go. Is that better for everybody? Actually, just let me know if that's not better. Okay, good. So the next thing I want to do is add a column after. Now, a lot of the initial steps are just going to come with practice. Once you've used Exago more often, you know the layout that you're comfortable with. So I'm creating a layout that I'm very comfortable with. Similarly, column widths and row heights, they're really going to come with time. You're going to figure out what works for you, what makes sense to you, and maybe not just you, maybe what looks good within the application that you're creating these reports for. So along those same lines, I'm just going to define, some values that I know that I like here. So give me just a second. Okay. And I'm going to do some row heights as we move along as well, but I'm going to wait until we actually get to the point that we need to affect those, right? All right, so we know we need some more sections. Let's start there. I'm going to click my page header, add some group headers first. We want employee ID, right? Everybody should be pretty familiar with this step. We also want country. Now I'm going to add footers on the same. So this is really the same process repeated. Remember that these footers are going to hold the aggregate information to be displayed in the headers for us. Okay. Now, first thing I'm going to do is add some column headers. If we go back to our output, I've left the output up here. We can see, let's just shrink this back up. We can see that we have this header, employee average days to ship, total late deliveries. One of the most common things that people do when they're first using Exago is place the column headers in the same section as the data-driven headers. By data-driven headers, I mean Devolio Nancy, 8, 7, the actual calculated values, and data values. That will make these headers, employee average days to ship and total late deliveries, repeat in between each of these data-driven rows. I don't want that, so it's a good practice to get into to just place your column headers in the section above. For that reason, I'm going to put them in the page header section today. So I'm going to open up row 3. I'm actually going to set this one manually, so it's going to be 35 pixels. Since it is the first level of hierarchy, C and B should be merged together, and I'm actually going to merge D as well initially. Okay, so we've got employee here. This one should read average days to ship, and this one should read total late deliveries. Now I'm going to do some additional formatting at the end, but I'm just going to make these a little bit bigger and bold so that I get the sizing down initially, right? Now this row here, this first row in header, the header on employees, let me slide this so you can see what these sections are on. This is going to hold our data values. We're not going to add this yet. This is going to hold a cell reference. We don't have anything to reference yet. We're going to build this up in a bit. So the next structure to talk about is our our header on employee, right? Now this is going to hold a few things. The first is row 4, then we're going to need a couple more rows. So let's set the row height here to be 35 as well. Okay, great. We're just matching up the sizing here. Row 5 is going to be for space. We're actually going to use our canvas to dictate some space, and one of the things that this reminds me to do is turn off the grid. Since I'm using a row for simple spacing, I don't want it to show those grid lines. Going to the report viewer options, I can uncheck show grid. While I'm here, might as well uncheck simulate PDF. I want this to be nice and wide. All right, row 6, right here, this third row in employees, this is going to hold our chart. Since I don't have the data on my canvas yet, I'm just going to open it up, merge all the cells together, right? Just recall that this is what's going to hold our chart. It kind of leaves a placeholder in our minds so we're able to know where to come back to. Row 7 is going to hold some, row 7 is going to live in the employee header and hold column headers for the country header. So again, I'm going to set this to be 35. Now, since this is for the country header, I want that additional indentation. I'm going to leave B and just merge C and D this time. That's going to read country. These are going to be the same, so I can select the cell, hold Control, and drag down my text. This is a good way to copy from one cell to the other. It will copy all formatting as well. Can also use my paintbrush. I'm going to be using that a lot today. Copy the formatting from here to the country cell, very quickly makes it just as big and bold. One click instead of 2. All right. The next thing I need in my country header is going to be the actual row for the data. So I'm just going to open this up to be 35. Again, dictating the row height manually can simply serve as a placeholder in my head, right? It's going to be something to just indicate to me, come back here, add the right values. Going to merge this together as well. Now I'm at my detail section, and we just learned that we can use additional rows for spacing. So I'm going to enter one for spacing. Additionally, we should be putting our column headers in the grouping above. So we want column headers for our detail section. This means we should set it in the country header. Let's set this row height as well, and 30 is actually perfect for that. So I dragged luckily. All right, these headers are going to read order ID, order date. Now I'm mimicking the output here. You guys don't need to memorize what what you want on each report and as what your column headers should be. I've just created this report a few times, so I know exactly the headers I'm looking for, but this is all I'm mimicking right now. So we have order date. This should read days to ship, and this one should read schedule. Okay, great. Again, we'll save most of the formatting for later, but let's just do a bit. We're going to make these size 10. We'll bold them as well, and we'll come back to them in just a moment. We're going to input the detail information next. So I'm actually going to set this row height, maybe I like 30. We'll make it nice and big. And these two footers are going to hold data, but they're going to be suppressed. So I don't actually need to format them at all. I'm just making them a little bit bigger so that we can read the data we're going to put in there. So let's start at the most granular level with the actual data input here. That would be the detail section. One of the reasons for doing so is that a lot of the formulas, like I mentioned, can be derived from the formulas that will exist in the detail section first at its simplest form. So I'm going to start here Order ID and order date are really just data values. I don't need to do any formulas here, so let's drag those over. Days to ship, however, is our first formula of the day. So I'm going to go to my editor. Now, I've told you guys this before. The best way, the easiest way for me to create formulas is to say it out loud, then try to write down what I just said. In this case, I'm looking for the difference in days between the date of the order, or the order date, and the shipped date, right? We want our handy date diff. If you haven't used this particular formula before, function before rather, it expects 3 arguments. The first is an interval. I want days. The second is the subtrahend, order date according to my spoken summary. And the minuend, which is going to be the shipped date. Now, the other thing that we had on output, and I'm going to go back to the finished report, is the text days. This makes this formula 2 parts. The second part, and the easy part, is just adding the string days. Now, important thing to notice, I put the space here because I don't want it to be the difference in days, that numeric value, and then days with no space. I do want a little bit of readability there. These are things that when you say them to people, they sound obvious, but they get missed in the initial formula writing the first time a bunch of times. So rather than come back, just make this common practice. Finally, the schedule formula is going to look similar, a little bit different. The biggest difference here is that the value that we actually want to display in the cell will not be the numeric value. It will be text indicating whether it's on time or late. This means we need an if statement, and the date diff is part of the condition of the if statement. If that doesn't make sense right off the bat, bear with me. What this will do is evaluate the date diff within my if statement. So the first thing we're going to look at here is the number of days between the shipped date and the required date. Now, let's assume they'll get there in 2 days. Now, this might not be true, but for the sake of the lab, assume they'll get there in 2 days. So if there's more than 2 days between the shipped date and the required date, we know that it's going to be late. For this reason, we want to say, if the date diff is greater than 2, it'll get there on time. So if this is true, the first will always evaluate to true or false. Must always evaluate to true or false. That's an awesome question. I'm going to pause for 1 second. Text qualify of single quote or double quotes both seem to work. There is not a preferred one. The reason that you might use one over the other is if you need a a single quote in whatever you're trying to return. So if I'm trying to return, this is a great example, on time for my first, and this one should read somebody's in trouble. And I want to put a quote there, right? I might use a double so I can use my single in there and it'll recognize it, right? Okay, great. I'm actually just going to say late. We're not going to get anybody in trouble here. Take a second if this didn't make sense while I was building it. Just read this formula out loud. It really makes a lot of sense if you read it to yourself. All right, great. So we're all good there. That's what we're looking for. Just press OK. It's going to populate here. We're all good. We're making progress. Now I'm just going to center these. Again, most of it at the end, little bits here. Now we're going to populate our footer. Now we can actually run this report at this point and take a look. We have no data, but our spacing is great. We've got our employee information, or rather our headers, no info yet, and our country within. And then our line items look awesome. 11 days to ship, on time. Looks like we've got a lot of on times here. That's great. Back to design. So the next thing we want to do is populate our country footer. Now, what data are we driving with the country footer? Actually, 2 sets of data. The first thing is going to be the chart. The second is the header on country. So what we need to do first is consider the chart inputs. we're going to need the country itself to use as the labels, the average days to ship, and the order count. The average days to ship doubles in that country header. We also need total late deliveries. So that's 4 inputs that we need to pull from this footer. The first is easy, country. The second is easy as well. We need the ag count of the order ID, right? The easiest way to count something up and make sure that you're doing it accurately is to use the ID field. Days to ship is a good one because though it's based on this formula, we need to take the average of it. This is a line item. In the footer, we want the average for the entire country. But I don't need the days. So I'm just going to copy this piece, the date diff calculation. Now I'm going to go into my formula editor, going to do an ag average, and paste in that date diff formula. This took about half the time since I built it from the detail one. Okay, make sure we have the right number of parentheses. We're all good. This is a fun formula too, and particularly the one I'd like you to pay attention to if you're new to formula building. We're going to use an ag sum if as well as a cell reference. These are 2 really fun things to do. Using an ag sum if, right? So a nested if statement within an ag sum formula allows us to only add up values that meet a certain condition. Now, in this case, it's particularly cool because what we want to add up is the number of times this cell, if you can see me, I'm actually pointing my mouse behind the formula editor. This cell in the detail row that's calculating whether or not the shipment is on time or late. We want to know how many times this cell evaluated to late. So instead of writing the entire formula again, we're just going to use a cell reference. If, and it should be F11, right? F11, great. So we use our square brackets. Now, when I type the cell, it actually shows me what's being calculated in there. This makes it a lot easier to build formulas using cell references without memorizing the cell that you're trying to reference, like I just did. It's also going to tell you which section you're referencing. So this is a cell in the detail section. That's very helpful as well. We want to know if F11 equals late. Give me a 1. Now, this is the part that sometimes takes a second for people to understand. We're returning 1 if F11 equals late. These 1s will all be added up to total the number of times that F11 equaled late. If it does not equal late, if it's anything but late, we're returning a 0, which adds 0 to our running sum and essentially does not affect it. That means that this sum will calculate the number of times F11 equals late, or the number of orders that did not get there on time. All right, so any questions on that, please continue to type or start now. But I'm going to keep going. This is a little bit of a longer lab. I do want to make sure that we get all of the content in today. Next thing I'm going to do is put my data in the employee footer. I don't need this information in the employee footer, and I don't need this information in the employee footer. I'm not showing either of those metrics in the employee header, and ultimately that's the only reason I need this footer. I do need these 2 metrics. Here's the cool part. I don't need them to be any different than I've already written them. All I have to do is hold control, and drag. Select, hold control, and drag. It's going to copy my formulas into the other footer. They are contextually aware, so they know to evaluate here for each country and here for each employee. Now at this point, I'd like to run this report. I'm going to just make these a little bit, I'm going to make them stand out a little bit. And let's turn these values just light pink maybe, right? So I just want to run this report to show you guys the progress that we've made. Now we have no alignment here, no formatting. It doesn't look very nice right now, but it is showing me the right metrics, 1 order, 0 late orders, 11 days to ship is the average because it's the only value. If I scroll down, I have 6.4, right? We can really see this start to come together. This is the reason that I run my reports as I'm designing them. I'm going to reference this cell and place it in the header, and now I know that I probably want to format that to cut off some of these repeating values. I don't want repeating decimals. I don't care if that's what it looks like. I just like to round to maybe 1 decimal point. Max, maybe I want to round to an integer. So running my report intermittently can show me things like this that I need to consider later on. So let's go back to design. I'm going to suppress these 2 footers. We don't actually need the data to show up on output. We just need to hold it somewhere. Moving up my canvas, let's do this country header. Get the data values in here. The first one is easy. I just need to show the country, so I can use the data field to do so. Average days to ship is going to be a cell reference to the average days to ship in the country footer. Make sure that we're referencing the right cell here. These are the same formula, but they'll return very different information. So let's actually do this one first. This one's just a cell reference, so I can generally do these without my formula editor. We know that we're going to want F12. See, it's really easy. F12 in this case. In this one, this is the value that we saw, the something 0.909090. So we're going to actually format this in the formula. So I'm going to use the formula editor for that. Exago has what's called a round function. Round allows you to input a number and the number of decimal places that you'd like to round to. I want to round to 1 decimal place, and my reference number is actually going to be a cell reference to E12. Right? And typing E12 shows me that I'm referencing the average ship days. That's exactly what I want, so I know I'm all good here. Okay, so let's just make these a little bigger, maybe 10, and we'll bold them so they match what we got here. Okay. Next thing I want to do is the data up in the employee header. Okay, great. So what I'd like to show here, oh, that's a really good question. So so we got a few people wondering why to use round instead of cell formatting. In this case, potentially you could do it either way and maybe not see a benefit or a negative one way or another, right? One of the reasons I showed you round today is that I think it's particularly helpful to know different ways to do the same thing. So really one of the reasons was just to show you an alternative route. But another thing to consider is that if we're showing something like this days to ship metric and we have a string appended to the end, the formatting applied directly to the cell might not take the way it would if we just had a decimal value returned. So the round function can allow you to format a numeric value within a string or within a concatenation that makes it a string. That's probably the use case where I would always use round over cell formatting directly. So hopefully that helps. Nick and Travis are the 2 services members here with me today to answer the question. So if they have any other tips and tricks from their time using Exago, I'm sure they'll respond in turn. All right, cool. So the next thing I wanted to do was my employee header, right? One of the good ways to do this is using a string concatenation. I don't just want to show the last name. I'd like to show last name and first name. Maybe I have 2 Buchanans. You've all heard me go through this. So let's do last name, ampersand. Again, account for your spacing. Just keep that in mind. And then your first name. Spaces don't matter in your formula. They just matter to me. Okay, press OK. Average days to ship is going to look just like this one, but we're going to have a different cell reference. So all we need to change in here is the row. We want to reference E13. Same deal here, F13. So I'm just going to do F and then a 13. Another benefit to dragging, you carry the formatting. So let me just do this. Okay, great. All right, so at this point, I'm going to give it another run. Really, the only functionality that we're missing right now is our chart. So let's take a look. The round function's working great. We've got 1 decimal point. We can see that all of these are a little bit different. Total late deliveries looks good too. We've got 4 late deliveries here, and I'm sure if we scrolled through all of the countries, we would see some that were not 0. Here's 1. We can continue to page through, right? But how painful is this to page through pages and pages of, of data like this, looking for those values? How much easier would it be if we could see that, you know, grouped and then expand just the grouping we're looking for? You guys can, this is probably a functionality that you've, or rather, a use case that you've worked around using drill downs before. Today, I'd like to show you how to do it in one report. First things first, let's add our chart. Now, there was a lot of things that we mentioned to keep in mind here, right? The first was that we had 2 y-axes. This indicates we need a combination chart. Easy peasy, I click combination chart, we're good to go. Now, the data setup changes based on that selection, so I don't need to actually affect anything here. It's going to expect a different input. But essentially, all I need to do here, and really the only thing that I need to keep in mind, is selecting the data from the right section. In this case, I'd like to pull from the footer on country. So I'm going to grab customers.country. That's my labels. That's really straightforward. Series values are going to be the average days to ship, as well as the order count, ag count of order ID. I'm going to render them both as a column. Some people prefer a column and a line. For the chart that we're creating today, I prefer the double column side-by-side look. Finally, we can name our series to make it really obvious to our users what metrics we're showing. So let's do average days to ship and order count. All right. Nothing else on the data tab that we need to touch today, so I'm going to leave it here and go to the appearance tab. Now I'm going to choose a theme. Let's go with Peter Book today. This is a particularly fun one. Okay. We can add chart titles and axes titles if we'd like. That's really not the focus of today's lab, so I'm going to kind of stay away from that. I do want to talk about the label display very briefly. When creating charts with anything other than like an integer as your x-axis labels, slant usually allows for the greatest readability unless your chart is super, super wide. So this is, again, just another one that you kind of pick up the more you use the tool. Chart axes. Adding a second y-axis is one of those less commonly used features, I think, at this point. So maybe you've never even tried this. It's really a pretty narrow use case from what I've seen, but that's one person's sample size. So all we need to do is dictate the difference between axis 1 and 2. Do we want decimal places to display differently? Do we want any currency symbols? For our use case today, we don't need to touch any of these options. Axes assignment is a big one as well. So average days to ship, we want on y-axis 1. Order count, we want on y-axis 2. This is the step that I see forgotten most often. People create the second y-axis and then forget to assign a metric to it. All right. Last step here was our benchmark line. Benchmark lines are really easy to add. We want a static one in this case. We're going to give it a value of 10. We're going to label it days to ship quota. Let's make it a deep red and dashed. Okay, really straightforward again. We can go to our size and preview. It's going to look a little small, but we see our dual y-axes, our chart type and the render types we've selected, as well as our benchmark line. All right, much bigger all spread out. Okay, so a couple more things to add functionally here, right? So the first thing that we also wanted to do, now just keep in mind that at this point, we have all of our data on our report. We could be done right now. We'd like to make this more readable, usable, consumable by anyone viewing the report. The tips that I'm going to continue to show you are really geared towards that. First things first, those collapsible groupings. These are a big one for readability. I'm going to collapse on the employee. I'm also going to collapse on the country because I'd like a hierarchical view here. That's a big one right off the bat. The next thing I'd like to do is add some conditional formatting, some row shading, and just a little bit of styling. Like I said, that's really not my forte, and it doesn't need to be to create a nice looking report. Start with the easy one. Let's do section shading. So on our details section, we're just going to add two different colors. The first one I actually want to not, I could select white. I'm going to leave it transparent. And I'll just do a very light gray. Okay. All right, great. Next thing I mentioned is the conditional formatting. Now, we had a whole bunch of conditional formatting. The nice thing is we can use our paintbrush to actually apply it to one cell and copy it if it's going to look the same on other cells. So the first one I'm going to do is actually in our detail row. We're going to format the schedule. So this one's really easy. They're all really easy. I shouldn't say that. Let's go to the schedule, add a condition. Foreground color, we want to turn it to this same red that I used in the benchmark line. This is one of the things that you can do to make your reports look a little nicer. Use a red that's less abrasive for conditional formatting like this, and match it up to another area of your chart. Tying areas of your report, tying areas of the report together can really create a feeling of consistency and make it look a little more complete. And we can take advantage of our cell value. All we want to do is highlight this if the cell value equals late. Again, really, really simple. Great. The next one that I'm going to do is the one right to the left of that. So in this case, actually, let's go up to total late deliveries first. So what we want to do here, and same thing here, here, and here, which makes this pretty cool, is format it to show up red if the cell value is greater than 10. I'm going to hold the control key and select these 4 cells. I can do this all at once. Go into my conditional cells menu, change this to red, again, same color, and we're going to use the cell value greater than 10. Now, this next piece, we're going to do a little bit differently. And for those of you watching the recording or attending live here as well, think to yourself why we can't format this cell the exact same way we did these. We want it to highlight if the value is greater than 10. Why can't we do it the same way we just did? Why didn't I select all 5 of those cells at the same time? If you're listening to the recording, pause me until you figure it out. If you're watching live, here we go. The reason is that we have this days string. You can't compare a string to an integer logically. Yeah, beautiful. People are writing in. Cool. Nicely done. So it's really that simple. If this days to ship returned an integer, we could very easily compare the integer value against another integer value. But in this case, we're going to have to actually define the formula in the conditional cell menu. That's fine. It's a simple formula that we've already written. But we're going to do it right here. So let's again go ahead into the conditional menu. Going to turn it red. Oops. Now we just need to define the date diff. We're writing the entire thing except for the days. Order date, ship date, and we want to turn it red if it's greater than 10. Now, regardless of what that cell returns, it'll be highlighted red if this formula evaluates to true for the line item. Okay, we're making some serious progress here. Let me just make sure that I covered everything. Yes, 2 things left. We need to sort by the aggregate of order count. We also need to do that bit of formatting. So let's sort by aggregate first, and then we'll really tie it together here. Sorting by aggregate with Exago is done using the top and bottom filter functionality. So what I'm going to do is limit the report to the top and bottom values. The way we do this is make the number here, where right now it says 10. When you first come into this, this menu, it'll say 10. We're going to pass it the largest value possible that Exago is then going to return all data and simply sort it in this order, top or bottom order. This value is going to be 2 billion and change. So there is an article on the support site about this particular functionality, sort by aggregate. It includes the value that you're going to want to use, so you don't need to memorize what I'm typing now. Grab it there. I'm just going to, okay, 4836. Just make sure I type it correctly, right? Because otherwise we're not doing a very good job. The value that I would like to actually sort by is important as well, right? So it's a bunch of things to take into account here. What I want to do in this case is sort by the ag count of the order IDs, but I want to make sure that I do it from the footer on country, since that's driving our chart. Now, I only have one place that I'm calculating that order count, but you guys are able to play around with this based on the particular chart that you're trying to create. The next piece I need in this case, and not always, but in this particular use case, it's very important. I need to choose a for each. I don't want to sort my whole report by this, just for each employee so that each chart sorts like that. Finally, and this is the last piece, I promise. I know this has been a bunch today, but like I said, I wanted to bring everything together into one complete report creation, and that's really what we've done here. The last piece is making it look pretty without killing ourselves over the formatting. I'm just going to center a couple of bits of information here. So having these left aligned and these centered tends to look really nice. We did apply some formatting here. We did some section shading in our detail section. The next thing that I sometimes affect is the text color. I just need to make this a little bit bigger. Apologies, I didn't do it before. Okay, great. The text color, sometimes a flat black can be a little bit abrasive. So using a gray, a very dark gray, or a dark blue can look really nice. This is one of the things that I take advantage of. Once I've put a chart on my report, I'm able to use a color picker and grab the colors that are actually used in that chart. And it looks like the screen share is messing up my color picker, so it won't find it. But if I'm able to match this blue and then highlight, I was going to do all of these cells here. In this dark blue, let's just pick one that looks really close. This one. Oh, apologies, that was the background. It can, again, serve to tie our report together. I'll grab the name of the color picker tool. I use one of the Chrome extension ones, as you guys can tell, so it's nothing special, but it works really well. Now, the next piece that I do is column headers sometimes. So if I can get it, let me see if I can get it to find this color. Nope. Wow, screen share is really throwing it off. Sorry about that, guys. The other piece of what I was going to show you guys is highlighting these column headers in the detail section. Let me just show you on the finished report. And I made them a gray, so everything country down is actually gray, not a flat black. And that gray value, or rather the blue background color on these column headers, is tying into the chart. So again, we're pulling the whole report together, bringing some continuity to it. We've got that dark blue in these headers. This is really now they're nothing special, but these are the formatting tips that I use when I'm creating reports to just pull them all together. Like I said, tie the top to the bottom and the groups together, make it look like one continuous report. So yes, I think that's the one, Scott. In reference to bringing it all together, what have we done today? We used collapsible groupings. We used cell referencing to show aggregate values in our headers. We have a ton of conditional formatting across the report indicating to us what values are of particular concern. This is really valuable for whoever's consuming the report. Opening up our collapsible groupings twice, we actually have line items with more conditional formatting. We talked about how to use detail formulas and build upon them to make formulas that might live in footers and maybe average information or conditionally collect items or values there. With regards to the chart, we talked about a dual y-axis, some tips for label display, as well as benchmark lines. So, in conclusion, I know that was a bunch. I hope you guys stayed with me and got a lot out of this lab. I definitely was very excited about it. Bringing everything together is where it all counts, right? Gonna just hop back over here. If you're typing any questions in, don't worry, we won't close it out immediately. I just wanted to bring us back to final steps here. What topics would you guys like to see in September? We've not yet chosen a topic. We're definitely playing with a few, but just wanted to let you guys know that we are still considering submissions on that post-lab survey, so let us know. Finally, tune in for the next lab on the 22nd. It's in 2 weeks for information regarding using custom functions to perform a year-to-date check and simplify that report design process. Both labs this month are really going to be geared towards understanding how to use Exago to simplify your design process. How can we make it as easy as possible to pump out really good looking reports that give us great information, great insights to data? This next lab is going to be extremely helpful. If I'm right in, in my intuition there, I really recommend it if you guys do year-to-date checks often or at all. So we hope to see you there. Without further ado, enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Thanks for joining me.